Three men gripped the chief executive's wrists inside a candlelit dining room, certain that money and muscle made them untouchable. They believed no one would dare interfere, not with bodyguards paid off and a plan already in motion. At the next table sat Mason Cole, a quiet single father in a worn jacket, eating a modest dinner trying to avoid trouble. But when Amelia Hart leaned close and begged him to save her life, he rose without hesitation. No one in that room knew the overlooked man beside them had once been trained to end a crisis before it began. If you love a cold-blooded twist that nobody sees coming, stay with this story until the very last word today. The restaurant sat on the top floor of a glass tower in downtown Chicago, the kind of place where wine cost more than a month of rent and waiters memorized faces before they memorized names. Amelia Hart arrived that evening dressed in pale gray, composed on the outside, though her stomach had been twisting since morning. She had discovered only hours earlier that her chief financial officer, Jackson Pierce, had been quietly moving sensitive financial records to servers outside the company's control. She told herself the dinner with two major investors was routine, a chance to reassure nervous money before a difficult quarter, but every glance toward the door felt heavier than it should have. Across the room, completely unnoticed, Mason Cole sat alone at a small table near the kitchen entrance, working through a plate of plain pasta because it was the only thing on the menu he could afford without flinching. He had no interest in the world of glass towers and quarterly reports. He only wanted a quiet meal before driving home to relieve the babysitter and check on his daughter, who barely entered his thoughts here except as a reason to stay out of trouble. A young server, refilling water glasses, mentioned without thinking that the woman in gray had specifically requested a table near the side exit, a small detail that meant nothing to most people in the room but registered instantly with Mason, who had spent years learning to notice when someone was quietly preparing to run. Minutes later, three men in expensive suits entered together, greeting the host with practiced charm and dropping the name of a fictitious hedge fund as though it explained everything. Across the restaurant, the two investors exchanged uneasy glances when Amelia's phone buzzed against the white tablecloth, the screen lighting up with a message from her personal attorney, Carter Miles. The message was brief and grim. Every piece of internal evidence she had gathered against Jackson Pierce had been blocked from upload, and her own executive credentials had just been frozen without warning. Amelia kept her expression even, the same calm mask she had worn through every board meeting since she became chief executive, but underneath it her pulse had begun to race. She excused herself politely, intending to step outside and call Carter directly, only to find the three men in suits had already drifted closer, forming a loose half-circle that blocked her path to the door. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Hunter Blake, spoke first, his voice friendly and low, suggesting she simply step into a private room down the hall to sign a few routine documents before midnight. Amelia's eyes flicked toward the restaurant's own security guard near the entrance, a man she recognized from prior visits, and felt a fresh wave of dread when he deliberately looked away instead of stepping forward. It became clear within seconds that whoever had orchestrated this evening had spent weeks preparing it, buying loyalty long before she ever sat down for dinner. A few tables away, Mason watched the scene unfold with the detached attention of a man cataloging details he wished he didn't notice. He saw the way one man kept his right hand angled awkwardly beneath his jacket, the telltale shape of a concealed earpiece tucked behind another man's collar, and the subtle repositioning of a fourth figure near the kitchen door that effectively sealed off the only easy escape route. None of it was dramatic on its own, but together it formed a pattern Mason had been trained to recognize long before he ever became a father, back when his job had involved protecting people whose names appeared in headlines rather than spreadsheets. He told himself it wasn't his business, that getting involved in a wealthy woman's private drama was exactly the kind of complication he had promised himself he would never invite into his life again. Still, something in the way the second man, Connor Reed, slid a chair sideways to physically block Amelia's path made Mason's jaw tighten in a way he didn't fully understand yet. He kept eating slowly, watching, waiting to see whether this was simply an aggressive negotiation or something far more dangerous, because acting too soon on instinct alone had once cost people their lives. Amelia herself had not arrived at that table by accident, and the unease she carried that evening reached back further than a single discovery of misplaced data. Hartwell Dynamics had been built by her mother, Grace Hart, from a single rented office and a stubborn refusal to cut corners, and Amelia had inherited the company along with an almost physical sense of obligation to the people who had trusted Grace with their careers. She had taken the chief executive seat at an age most considered far too young, surviving years of quiet condescension from board members who assumed her last name had bought her the position rather than the long nights she had spent learning every department from the ground floor up. The data she had discovered leaving the building that afternoon wasn't simply suspicious. It matched, almost exactly, a pattern her mother had once warned her about during the company's earliest and most vulnerable years, when a previous partner had tried something similar and failed only because Grace had refused to sign anything without reading every line twice. Amelia had spent the drive to the restaurant rehearsing calm, reasonable sentences to say to her investors, even as her mind kept circling back to the locked files Jackson had no legitimate reason to access. She told herself she would handle it quietly in the morning, through proper channels, never imagining that the people meant to enforce those channels had already been paid to look the other way. Mason's caution that evening had nothing to do with cowardice, and everything to do with a promise he had made to himself 2 years earlier, the night he signed final custody papers and drove home to an apartment quieter than he had expected. His daughter was the reason he had walked away from a career that once sent him overseas on short notice and kept him gone for weeks at a time. And he had told himself repeatedly since then that a steady, unremarkable life was worth more than any sense of purpose his old job had given him. He worked now installing and servicing security systems for small businesses around the city, a job that paid the bills and let him be home most evenings, predictable in a way his previous life never allowed. Trouble, in Mason's experience, rarely stayed contained to the moment it appeared. It spread, it followed people home, and he had learned the hard way that protecting a stranger sometimes meant exposing the people you loved most to risks they never agreed to take. That was the calculation running quietly behind his calm expression as he watched Amelia's situation deteriorate, weighing an old instinct against a newer, harder-won discipline. He had nearly convinced himself to simply finish his meal and leave through the back when her whispered plea reached him, close enough that ignoring it would have required a kind of deliberate cruelty he didn't possess. Hunter Blake's friendly tone disappeared the moment Amelia refused to walk toward the private room, replaced by a flat, businesslike command to stop wasting everyone's time. Connor Reed stepped in closer from her left side while the third man, Jason Vance, positioned himself directly behind her chair like a silent wall of muscle, cutting off any retreat toward the kitchen. The restaurant, full of wealthy patrons accustomed to minding their own affairs, fell into an uncomfortable hush, the kind of silence that comes from people deciding collectively that whatever was happening must be a private matter between the rich and powerful. Amelia scanned the room desperately, searching for any sign of help, but every gaze that met hers slid away within seconds, unwilling to risk involvement in a stranger's crisis. Hunter's hand closed around her wrist with enough pressure to make her breath catch, and as Connor yanked her chair backward, she stumbled directly into the edge of Mason's table, her palm bracing against the white cloth only inches from his plate. In that brief collision, with no one else close enough to hear, she turned her face toward him and whispered 3 words that would change the rest of that night completely. "Please help me." Mason set down his napkin with deliberate calm, rose from his seat, and looked at the 3 men with an expression that held none of the fear they expected from a stranger in a thrift store jacket. Hunter laughed first, the kind of laugh meant to remind everyone present exactly where the power in the room belonged, and asked Mason if he understood whose business he was interrupting. Connor added that this was a private matter worth more money than Mason would see in several years combined, the implication clear that a man dressed so plainly had no business raising his voice in a room like this. Jason simply sneered and told him to sit back down before he embarrassed himself in front of people who actually mattered. Mason said nothing about money or status, offering instead a single quiet instruction: let go of her hand. His voice carried no anger and no bravado, only the flat certainty of someone who had said similar words before under circumstances far worse than a crowded dining room. Amelia, still caught in Hunter's grip, felt something shift in the air, a recalibration of danger that the 3 men sensed but couldn't yet name. For the first time since the men had approached her table, she allowed herself to believe that this stranger in worn clothing might actually be capable of helping her. What happened next took less than 30 seconds, though to the handful of people watching it felt suspended in slow motion. Mason stepped forward and caught Hunter's wrist in a controlled grip, twisting the angle of the joint just enough to force him to release Amelia without breaking anything, a technique born from years of training rather than raw aggression. Connor lunged toward him from the side, and Mason used the edge of an empty chair to redirect his momentum, sending him stumbling into a nearby serving cart with a clatter of silverware rather than a punch. Jason tried to close off the path toward the kitchen, but Mason pivoted low, hooked a foot behind his ankle, and used his own forward weight against him, leaving him sprawled awkwardly without a single dish broken on the surrounding tables. There was no blood, no shouting, no chaos of the kind people expect from a fight in the movies, only the precise, almost clinical efficiency of someone who had clearly done this before under far higher stakes. Amelia stood frozen for a moment, staring at the man who minutes earlier she hadn't even registered as a presence in the room. A man near the bar lifted his phone to record the scene, capturing just enough to later prove that 3 men had laid hands on her first. Mason called out to the restaurant manager to phone the police immediately, but at that exact moment the lights along the private dining corridor flickered and the section's security cameras went dark, confirming that whoever planned this evening had anticipated exactly this kind of resistance. The other diners, who moments earlier had pretended not to notice anything happening at all, now stared openly, whispering to one another in the particular hushed tone reserved for events too strange to fully process. A waiter dropped a tray near the bar, the crash of glass briefly drawing every eye away from Mason before snapping back to him just as quickly. Amelia became aware, almost distantly, that her hands were shaking, though the fear that had gripped her only minutes earlier had already started giving way to something closer to disbelief. She had expected, if anyone intervened at all, a brief shouting match or a clumsy scuffle quickly broken up by restaurant staff, not the controlled, almost surgical sequence she had just witnessed. Mason, breathing only slightly harder than before, scanned the room once more, noting exits, noting faces, already calculating what came next rather than dwelling on what had just happened. Realizing the blackout was no accident, Mason grabbed Amelia gently by the elbow and steered her away from the main dining room rather than toward the obvious front entrance, where reinforcements would likely already be waiting. He guided her instead through a narrow service hallway reserved for staff, weaving past startled waiters carrying trays of untouched appetizers. Amelia, breathless, asked who he was and how he knew so quickly that the cameras going dark meant real danger rather than a simple electrical fault. Mason answered only that he used to work in protective security, offering nothing more as they moved quickly down a stairwell that smelled of bleach and old steam from the kitchen below. Behind them, raised voices indicated that Hunter and his men had recovered and were calling for backup, confirming that the original 3 attackers were not working alone. Mason pushed open a heavy door into the alley behind the restaurant, the cold air hitting them both as sirens wailed faintly somewhere across the city, still too far away to be of any immediate use. Amelia tried to dial Carter Miles, but Mason stopped her hand gently, warning that if her phone's location had already been compromised, calling anyone now would only draw their pursuers directly to wherever they stood. He took her phone, removed the battery and the small chip inside with practiced efficiency, and explained in a few clipped sentences that anything connected to a network could be traced within minutes by someone determined enough. Amelia stared at him with a mixture of gratitude and unease, unable to reconcile the calm precision of his actions with the modest, almost invisible man she had bumped into only minutes earlier. She admitted quietly that she still didn't fully trust him, since ordinary security guards didn't dismantle phones or disable threats with such effortless control. Mason didn't argue the point, telling her only that trust could wait until she was somewhere safe, and that for now she needed to focus on saying as little as possible about her plans. They moved together through the alley and into an underground parking garage 2 blocks away, ducking behind a row of parked vehicles whenever headlights swept too close. In the relative safety of that concrete space, Amelia finally caught her breath enough to ask the question that had been building inside her since the first chair scraped against the floor. Who exactly was Mason Cole, and why did a man who claimed to fix security systems for a living move like someone trained for war? A black sedan rolled slowly past the garage entrance moments later, its headlights sweeping across the rows of parked cars in a deliberate searching pattern that told Mason its driver wasn't simply passing through. He pulled Amelia down behind a delivery van, pressing a finger briefly to his lips, counting the seconds until the sedan's engine faded into the distance toward the next block. Amelia's heart pounded so loudly she was certain it could be heard, yet Mason remained perfectly still beside her, his breathing slow and even in a way that seemed almost unnatural given the circumstances. When the street finally fell silent again, He rose and checked both directions before guiding her toward a service exit on the garage's far side, one rarely used and therefore unlikely to be watched. He explained quietly that men hired for a single night's job rarely thought to cover every possible route, since their employer had likely briefed them only on the most obvious paths a frightened executive might take. Amelia found herself studying him in the dim light, struck by how effortlessly he predicted the thinking of men who only an hour earlier had seemed utterly in control of everything around them. Mason exhaled slowly and admitted, with visible reluctance, that years earlier he had worked inside a specialized unit responsible for protecting executives and diplomats during moments of extreme crisis, long before family responsibilities forced him to choose a quieter life. He explained that he had once trained emergency response teams for a major defense contractor, learning to read danger the way other people read weather patterns, anticipating storms long before the first drop of rain fell. He told her plainly that he wanted nothing to do with wealth, power, or the kind of corporate warfare that clearly surrounded her, since that world had already cost him more than he was willing to discuss in a parking garage at midnight. Amelia, stung but not deterred, pointed out that she, too, was currently being betrayed by people with enormous power, the very people who were supposed to protect the company her family had built from nothing. She admitted, her voice tightening, that Jackson Pierce intended to sell Hartwell Dynamics to an unverified group of buyers before an internal audit could expose what he had been hiding for months. Mason studied her for a long moment, recognizing something in her exhaustion that didn't match the arrogant chief executive stereotype he had expected from someone running a billion-dollar company. He realized, almost against his will, that the woman in front of him wasn't trying to protect her own throne so much as trying to stop a theft that would hurt thousands of employees who had no idea their company was already being sold out from under them. Meanwhile, inside a private conference room on the top floor of Hartwell Dynamics' headquarters, Jackson Pierce paced in front of a wall of city lights, phone pressed hard against his ear as Hunter Blake reported the failure at the restaurant. Jackson's controlled exterior cracked instantly, his voice dropping into a furious whisper as he demanded to know how 3 trained men could lose control of one unarmed woman and a stranger in a second-hand jacket. His plan had been simple in design, even elegant in his own mind. Isolate Amelia for a few critical hours, force her to sign documents transferring controlling authority, then quietly announce her resignation due to mounting personal stress before anyone could question the timing. The internal audit scheduled for the following morning threatened to expose years of falsified transactions, shell accounts, and a series of contracts designed to funnel company assets toward buyers with no legitimate business history. Jackson knew Amelia possessed a hidden encrypted backup of evidence damning enough to end his career and likely his freedom, but he had not yet discovered where she had concealed it. Determined to regain control of the narrative, he ordered his closest allies to quietly spread word among the board that Amelia had suffered a mental breakdown and abandoned her post under pressure, a story crafted specifically to make any future claims from her sound unstable and unreliable. He then turned his full attention toward finding out exactly who the stranger from the restaurant was, sensing correctly that this unexpected variable threatened to unravel everything he had built in the shadows. Jackson Pierce had not arrived at this scheme overnight. He had spent nearly 3 years cultivating relationships with a group of overseas buyers who operated through shell companies layered so deeply that even a skilled forensic accountant would need months to trace the money back to its true source. He had convinced himself, in the particular way ambitious men often do, that he deserved more than the salary and title Hartwell Dynamics had given him, that the company's steady, principled growth under Amelia represented missed opportunity rather than careful stewardship. Each falsified contract he signed felt smaller than the last, a gradual erosion of conscience that began with minor accounting adjustments and grew over time into outright theft disguised as strategic restructuring. He had recruited Hunter Blake, Connor Reed, and Jason Vance months earlier, former security contractors he had met through a mutual acquaintance, men whose loyalty to money far outweighed any loyalty to the company that had once employed them. Jackson paid them well precisely because he intended every part of that night to look clean. A quiet abduction, a signed document, a graceful resignation story released to the press before anyone thought to ask harder questions. What he hadn't accounted for was a stranger eating dinner alone, a man with no stake in corporate politics and no fear of 3 armed men in expensive suits. As midnight approached, Jackson grew increasingly aware that every passing hour without Amelia's signature brought the morning audit closer, and with it the very real possibility that his carefully constructed empire of lies would collapse entirely. He paced his office reviewing contingency after contingency, calling contacts who specialized in making problems disappear quietly, offering larger sums of money with each failed update from his men in the field. Beneath his composed exterior, a colder fear had begun to surface, the recognition that a man who built his entire plan on controlling information had lost control the moment a stranger intervened where no stranger should have been able to. He told himself repeatedly that Mason was simply a complication, a low-level obstacle that money could eventually remove, refusing to consider the possibility that some people couldn't be bought because they had nothing they wanted to sell. That blind spot, more than any single mistake in his elaborate scheme, would prove to be the crack through which everything he had built eventually came crashing down. Back in the parking garage, Amelia finally revealed the one piece of information she had been guarding most carefully. A secondary server long forgotten by most of the company still sat active inside her mother's old private office across town. Grace Hart, Amelia's mother and the company's original founder, had insisted years earlier on keeping a separate, manually maintained backup system, distrustful even then of how easily digital records could be manipulated by ambitious executives. Mason listened carefully, weighing the risk of involving himself further against the growing certainty that walking away now would leave a dangerous man free to destroy an entire company built by people who had nothing to do with his crimes. He agreed to help her reach the office, but only on the condition that once they secured the evidence, she would hand everything directly to federal investigators rather than attempting to negotiate quietly through internal channels. Amelia agreed without hesitation, recognizing for the first time in years a kind of integrity that had nothing to do with boardroom politics or carefully worded press releases. They made their way across the city in a borrowed delivery van that Mason arranged through a contact who asked no questions, avoiding main roads where cameras and patrol cars might draw unwanted attention. Inside the old office building, dust-covered furniture sat undisturbed beneath dim emergency lighting, a forgotten relic of the company's humble beginnings standing in stark contrast to the glass tower that now bore the Hartwell name. Mason moved through the building methodically before allowing Amelia to proceed, checking each entry point, testing the elevator controls, and scanning the lobby's outdated camera system for any sign of tampering. Satisfied that the building remained untouched by Jackson's people, he allowed Amelia to lead him toward a small storage room on the third floor, where her mother had once kept the company's earliest financial records. Inside, behind a locked cabinet, they found exactly what they needed: copies of falsified wire transfers, a list of suspicious offshore accounts, and forged contracts bearing signatures that didn't match any legitimate board member. Amelia's hands trembled as she copied the files onto a small encrypted drive, finally holding tangible proof of the betrayal she had only suspected for weeks. Among the papers, Amelia found a faded photograph of her mother standing in that very office decades earlier, surrounded by boxes and unopened paint cans, looking exhausted but unmistakably proud. She paused for a moment longer than she meant to, tracing the edge of the photograph with one finger, thinking about how casually Jackson had been willing to erase everything that image represented. Mason, watching her from the doorway, said nothing about the photograph, understanding instinctively that some moments needed silence rather than reassurance. He instead continued scanning the documents spread across the desk, recognizing financial patterns he had seen before in other corrupt organizations, the same slow, deliberate siphoning of money dressed up as routine business expense. The scale of it surprised even him, the casual confidence required to falsify contracts worth such enormous sums while still attending board meetings and shaking hands with people he was actively robbing. Amelia finally closed the cabinet, the drive secure in her pocket, and allowed herself one short breath of something close to relief before the alarm shattered the moment entirely. Without warning, a shrill alarm cut through the silence of the building, confirming what Mason had feared the moment they arrived. Jackson's people had anticipated this location and triggered the security system the second their presence registered. Mason grabbed the drive, ushered Amelia toward the stairwell, and told her firmly that whoever was coming for them now already knew far more than they should have. Somewhere between leaving the restaurant and entering her mother's old office, someone close to Amelia had quietly revealed their location. That someone arrived only minutes later in the form of Carter Miles, breathless and apologetic, claiming he had rushed over the instant he heard the alarm trip remotely through the building's monitoring service. Mason studied him carefully, noting the impossible speed of his arrival and the faint nervous tremor in his voice, details that didn't match a man simply reacting to an alert. Pressed gently but firmly, Carter finally broke, confessing through tears that Jackson had threatened both his career and his family unless he revealed Amelia's likely destination once she went missing from the restaurant. Amelia stared at him with the particular kind of pain reserved for betrayal by someone trusted since childhood. Her father's old friend turned into an unwilling instrument of her downfall. Rather than condemning him outright, Mason saw an opportunity in Carter's guilt, pushing him instead to make amends by contacting Evelyn Brooks, a respected investigative journalist known for exposing corporate corruption with relentless precision. Carter agreed immediately, desperate to undo even a fraction of the damage he had caused, dialing Evelyn's number with shaking hands while Mason watched for any sign of further deception. Amelia understood in that quiet moment that relying solely on lawyers and boardroom allies had nearly cost her everything, and that real protection now depended on exposing the truth publicly before Jackson could bury it again. With the clock pushing toward midnight, Jackson convened an emergency session of the board inside Hartwell Dynamics' main headquarters, announcing gravely that Amelia had vanished under circumstances suggesting a serious mental health crisis and possible sabotage of company assets. He proposed an immediate vote to remove her from her position, framing the move as a necessary act of protection for shareholders rather than the calculated coup it truly was. Unbeknownst to him, Mason and Amelia were already making their way toward the building through a maintenance corridor. Mason had identified earlier, a route built for technicians rather than executives, and therefore overlooked by Jackson's hired men. Mason explained quietly that years earlier he had helped design portions of the very security protocols still used in similar corporate towers, giving him an unusually precise understanding of the building's blind spots. As expected, Hunter, Connor, and Jason intercepted them again near a service elevator, having anticipated correctly that Amelia would attempt to reach the boardroom before the vote concluded. The corridor was narrow and dimly lit, lined with exposed pipes and humming electrical panels, a space never meant to host any kind of confrontation. Hunter's expression carried none of the smug confidence from earlier in the night, replaced now by the tight, focused look of a man who understood he had already failed once and couldn't afford to fail again. Connor moved to flank Mason from the left while Jason positioned himself to cut off Amelia's retreat, the three of them clearly having discussed exactly how they intended to finish what they had started at the restaurant. Mason kept his voice low and even, telling Amelia simply to wait for his signal, his eyes never leaving the three men as he calculated the narrow space and the limited room any of them had to maneuver. Amelia, for her part, was no longer the frightened woman who had been dragged backward from her dinner table hours earlier. Something in her had hardened into a quiet, focused determination that matched the gravity of what waited above them. This time, however, Amelia didn't simply stand behind Mason waiting to be protected. She used her intimate knowledge of the building's fire safety systems to seal one corridor and isolate Jason from his two allies entirely. Mason handled Hunter and Connor with the same controlled, efficient precision he had shown at the restaurant, ensuring neither man sustained serious injury while Amelia regained access to the executive floor through an override code only she and her mother had ever known. Amelia walked into the boardroom alone at first, leaving Mason positioned quietly near the door, determined to let her reclaim her authority through her own words rather than through force. Jackson's face shifted instantly from practiced concern to barely controlled panic, quickly recovering enough to claim publicly that Amelia's sudden appearance only proved how unstable she had become under pressure. He insisted the evidence she carried had been fabricated and accused the stranger lingering near the entrance of being a hired agitator paid to destabilize the company on her behalf. The directors seated around the long table shifted uncomfortably, caught between years of professional deference to whoever held the loudest voice in the room and a growing unspoken suspicion that something about Jackson's story didn't add up. One older board member, a man who had served alongside Grace Hart since the company's earliest days, asked quietly why an audit scheduled for the following morning had suddenly become so urgent to avoid discussing tonight of all nights. Jackson brushed the question aside with practiced smoothness, reminding the room that shareholder confidence depended on swift, decisive action rather than prolonged debate over a chief executive's apparent breakdown. Amelia let him talk, watching him build his own narrative taller and taller, recognizing that every confident word he spoke now would only make his eventual collapse more complete. She had learned, over years of difficult negotiations, that the most dangerous moment for a liar wasn't being challenged outright but being given enough room to overreach. Amelia ignored the accusation entirely, projecting the financial documents onto the boardroom's main screen, walking the stunned directors through falsified transactions, shell accounts, and contracts bearing forged signatures one by one. She spoke calmly and methodically, pointing out the exact dates certain transfers had occurred, dates that matched suspiciously with quarters Jackson had personally overseen with unusual secrecy. Several directors leaned forward, their earlier deference giving way to genuine alarm as the pattern Amelia laid out became impossible to dismiss as coincidence or fabrication. Jackson interrupted repeatedly, his voice rising with each objection, insisting the numbers had been manipulated by someone determined to destroy his reputation out of personal spite. Just as several board members began exchanging uneasy glances, Evelyn Brooks broadcast a recorded confession from Carter Miles directly to every screen in the room, confirming in his own words that Jackson had orchestrated the entire night's events. Carter's voice, shaking but clear, described in detail how Jackson had threatened both his career and his family unless he revealed Amelia's location once she disappeared from the restaurant. A confession that left no room for ambiguity about who had set the night's events into motion. Footage from the restaurant began circulating moments later as well, showing clearly that 3 men had seized Amelia first, stripping away any remaining doubt about who the true aggressor had been from the very beginning. The room fell into stunned silence as one director after another realized they had nearly voted only minutes earlier to remove the one person who had actually been protecting the company's interests all along. Jackson's composure, so carefully maintained through every earlier challenge, finally began to fracture, his hands tightening on the edge of the table as the weight of exposure pressed down on him in front of people whose trust he had spent years cultivating. Cornered and desperate, he made one last attempt to regain control of the room, insisting that everyone present was overreacting to a misunderstanding that could still be resolved quietly. In his desperation to defend himself, he blurted out an admission that he had personally ordered Amelia's abduction, a confession the entire board, and several recording devices, captured in real time. Police and federal investigators arrived within the hour, moving through the building with the kind of quiet efficiency that follows overwhelming evidence rather than uncertain suspicion. Jackson Pierce was arrested first, followed shortly by Hunter Blake, Connor Reed, and Jason Vance, each one quickly abandoning loyalty to a boss who had already incriminated himself beyond saving. Amelia stood at the center of it all, finally restored to her position, surrounded by directors who suddenly remembered how to show respect now that the danger had passed. Yet instead of celebrating, she noticed Mason slipping quietly toward the elevator, his posture relaxed, as though the entire ordeal had simply been another shift in a long, forgettable workday. She caught up to him in the marble lobby downstairs, breathless not from exertion but from the sudden fear that he intended to disappear from her life as quickly as he had entered it. Mason told her plainly that he didn't belong in her world of boardrooms and headlines, insisting he had only done what any decent person should have done the moment they witnessed someone in danger. Amelia countered softly that decency had clearly been in short supply that night, since an entire restaurant full of people had looked away while only he had chosen to stand. Rather than offering him money in a way that might feel like an insult to what he had done, Amelia proposed something different, a position as an independent security consultant for Hartwell Dynamics, with full authority to refuse any assignment that conflicted with the quiet life he had built for himself and his family. Mason hesitated, weighing the offer against years of deliberately avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement, but something in her sincerity, free of arrogance or performance, made him reconsider. He agreed cautiously, on the condition that his involvement remain limited and private, with no public statements, no interviews, and no attention drawn to the daughter who depended on him living a quiet, ordinary life. Amelia accepted without argument, understanding instinctively that his protection of her had never been about recognition, but about a simple refusal to let cruelty go unanswered. In the weeks that followed, Hartwell Dynamics announced a sweeping restructuring built on transparency, replacing compromised executives with leaders chosen for integrity rather than convenience. Carter Miles voluntarily surrendered every piece of evidence he had once concealed, accepting the legal consequences of his earlier betrayal as the price of finally doing right by the family that had trusted him for decades. Evelyn Brooks published an extensive investigation into the entire affair, turning what had nearly been a quiet corporate crime into a very public reckoning that few involved would soon forget. Amelia changed the way she led from that point forward, no longer extending blind trust to anyone simply because they wore an expensive suit and spoke with practiced confidence. She learned to look instead for the kind of quiet integrity she had glimpsed in a stranger's eyes across a crowded restaurant, the kind that didn't announce itself with charm or status. Mason, for his part, returned to his ordinary routine, taking only the occasional consulting assignment when it didn't threaten the careful peace he had built for his small family. He never sought credit for what happened that night, never gave interviews, and never allowed his name to become part of the story that eventually spread far beyond Chicago. Grace Hart, hearing the full account of what her daughter had endured, told Amelia quietly that she finally understood why she had always insisted on keeping that old office untouched, as though some part of her had always known it might one day matter again. Amelia visited her mother more often in the months that followed, the two of them speaking with a new honesty that years of polished boardroom language had slowly worn away. The company itself began to feel different too, employees noticing a chief executive who walked the floors more often, who asked harder questions of anyone who seemed too eager to avoid scrutiny. Evelyn Brooks' published investigation drew attention from other companies quietly grappling with similar internal corruption, and for a brief season Hartwell Dynamics became an unlikely symbol of accountability rather than scandal. Mason watched all of this unfold from a comfortable distance, occasionally reading a headline online before closing the browser and returning to whatever ordinary task waited for him that evening. Months later, Amelia returned to the same restaurant where everything had begun, requesting the same quiet corner table near the kitchen entrance, and invited Mason to join her for dinner. This time there was no panic in her eyes, no whispered plea for help, only a calm gratitude that needed no dramatic gesture to express itself. Mason arrived in the same worn jacket, unconcerned with appearances in a room that had once dismissed him entirely, and Amelia found herself smiling at the small, stubborn consistency of that choice. They spoke for a long while about ordinary things, the kind of conversation neither of them had allowed themselves the luxury of having in weeks, and for the first time since that chaotic night, the silence between them felt comfortable rather than tense. As they sat together, surrounded by the same soft lighting and quiet murmur of other diners, both of them understood a simple truth that the whole ordeal had revealed. Sometimes the person the world overlooks completely is the only one in the room with the courage to stand.